Question number 21. How can we answer critics who claim that Jesus was wrong when he said he would return before the end of his generation in Matthew chapter 24 and verse number 34? So we're going to turn there and we're going to see what Jesus actually said. But this question is somebody, I don't know where he heard it from, if it was YouTube or if it was a friend or, it was just simply somebody was saying, oh, Jesus said that he was going to come back in his generation and he didn't. And so therefore, since he was wrong about that, he's wrong about everything else. And how can we trust him? And so, the person who asked this question was saying, how can we answer that? Okay. And so we've got 24 and 34, and this is what Jesus said. He said, I tell you the truth, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. Now look at verse 36. No one knows about that day or hour, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Okay? So the simple answer to this would be, Jesus said that this generation isn't going to pass away. Notice he didn't say his generation, he said this generation, and that does make a difference. He said this generation isn't going to pass away until these things come about. But then he goes on down to say that he doesn't know when this is going to happen, right? It doesn't make any sense for Jesus to say it's going to happen, and if he was meaning this generation, it doesn't make any sense for him to say it's going to be happening in my lifetime, but then just a short ways away, he comes along and says, I have no idea when this is going to happen. And so if you look at it in that regard, you can see that, that's not what Jesus meant, quite obviously, all right? So what did Jesus mean? Well, notice he said this generation, not my generation, okay? And so when he says this generation, maybe we need to kind of go back and put everything into context and see what Jesus was talking about. Because after all, I've said it before, you can't look at the Bible as far as this verse and this verse and this verse. Every single verse is connected to other verses, and those verses are, make up paragraphs. Paragraphs make up chapters. Chapters make up books. 66 books make up the Bible. And so if you really want to understand what the Bible's about, you've got to put everything in its context. If you don't put things in their context, then it's only a pretext. Okay? So, what was Jesus talking about in this chapter? So in Matthew chapter 24, Jesus is leaving the temple for the last time. And as he is leaving Jerusalem and going up the Mount of Olives, he had just said, when he is looking at all the temple structures, that not one stone was going to be left on another one. Okay? And so what Jesus was referring to was the Romans were going to come in 70 AD, and they were going to destroy the temple. But what the disciples interpreted what Jesus meant was about the end times. And so they came up to him privately and said, when will this happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And so Jesus starts out by saying in chapter 24 and verse 4, watch out that nobody deceives you. Okay? And so right off the bat, he's giving them a warning and saying, you know what? You guys need to look at things a little bit differently than what you're doing. And so they're looking at it right here now, but he's saying it really isn't right here now. As a matter of fact, what he's saying here is that there's going to be many people that come and say, I'm the Christ. They're going to deceive many people. There's going to be wars, rumors of wars, but the end is not yet to come. There's going to be earthquakes. There's going to be persecutions. There's going to be all kinds of things that go on, but at the same time, the end is not yet. As a matter of fact, if you skip on down to verse number 14, he says, the gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. And so if you want to know about when the end is coming, it's when the gospel is going to be preached to all nations. But then he goes on down in verse 15 to talk about a prophecy in the Old Testament. And he says, verse 15, so when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand, then you better get out of town. Those that are in Judea better flee the mountains. If you're out in the field, don't go back to get your cloak. If you're up on your roof, don't go down in your house to get things. It's going to be very, very terrible for people when this happens. Now, what this is about is when the Antichrist comes into the temple and says, I am God. And by doing that, he is going to be the abomination that causes the sacrifice to cease, and that is going to be the desolation that stops all of that worship. And when that happens, the covenant that he has made with the nation of Israel is broken, and so then all of this persecution is going to come upon the Jewish nation. It is going to be so bad that, as he says in verse number 21, for there will be great distress, unequal from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. And so, you know, if you think about the persecution that the Jewish people have endured down through the centuries, I mean, it's been horrendous. The Holocaust is horrible. But the persecution that's going to be coming is even going to be worse than that. It's going to be so bad that he says here in verse number 22, if those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. And so what we have here, as far as the Antichrist's persecution, is to, a little sloppy, but we get the idea that that was supposed to be a straight line. We get the idea that what the Antichrist is trying to do is get the Jewish people's population down to zero. I mean, we're talking about genocide of an entire group of people. And Jesus said, if those days had not been cut short, then that would be the case. But they are cut short with Jesus' coming. Okay? And so this, we're going to say that this is, you know, the abomination of desolation, okay? All right. So here we've got this time period that's going to be happening, all right? And the people in this time period, if you think about it, that is the generation that Jesus is talking about. And so when he says in verse number 34, that this generation will certainly not pass away, it's this generation right here that we're talking about.
Jesus is referring to a future generation.
Right. You know, and if you think about it, we're just assuming when we read them, we say, and if we just looked at verse number 34, when he's saying this generation, he's, you know, we're just assuming he's talking about this one. But when you put it in the context of what it's written, I think it's pretty obvious he's not talking about this generation. He's talking about another generation, a future generation. And this time period is going to be a very sudden, in relative respect to history. You know, we're not talking about, you know, decades or centuries or anything like that. You know, the time period between the abomination of desolation and Jesus is coming, it is going to be in a very fixed, determined time. Now, when all of that's going to take place, well, Jesus is saying nobody knows the day or the hour. And so it's not as if we can, you know, figure out and say, oh, well, Jesus is going to come back on, you know, October 24th, 2038, or whatever the case may be, because we really don't know. And if anybody comes up and says they do know, then they're really kidding themselves, because if Jesus didn't know, if the angels didn't know, then nobody else sure as heck going to know either, okay? So that could be one interpretation of this verse. Another interpretation of this verse is just simply the way that we define generation. You know, we define generation as we've got the baby boomers, right? And then we've got Gen X, then we've got the millennials, and then we got Gen Z, which I'm just kind of perplexed at the way that we want to lump whole groups of people into these categories and stereotype them and say, this is what your personality is, this is what you do, this is your traits and characteristics, when it really doesn't work out that way, does it? Okay. But this is kind of the way that we see generations, right? We want to lump groups of people. But you know what a generation is? Generation is a father giving birth to a son, okay? Or sons, all right? And that really is a generation right there. And if you think about a father in the case of, giving birth to not sons, but the sons giving birth to sons, and then we've got grandchildren and great-grandchildren, then what we have descendants. And so that's why generation can also mean race. It's not a very prominent definition of this word generation. As a matter of fact, in the 1984 NIV that I'm reading out of, that is a alternative translation of it. You see a little footnote there in verse 34, by generation, you come on down, it says, or race. Well, that's the reason why they come across race. And I don't necessarily, I think that interpretation is fine. If you like that interpretation, more power to you. There's nothing wrong with that. It still fits the context of what we're talking about, because we're talking about persecution of the Jewish people. But, I just kind of think that the other one is a little bit more on target. So anyway, there's the answer, at least my answer to the question. Do you guys have comments or questions about this? Please speak up. Paul, you got anything? It's okay if you don't.
When you're talking about the generation there,
Yeah.
it almost sounds like you're talking, excuse me, that whole family group. When does the next generation start? When the sons start having kids?
Yes.
Okay.
But that's just what I'm saying, is that the idea about generation, that the concept of generation is generating, okay? It's we want to put it in like, age groups. But generation really...
Mindset. Is it more mindset than
Well, no,
generation?
I'm saying it's a concept, because really what we're talking about is a Greek word, and, and to a lesser degree, a Hebrew word. And the thing is, words are an outcropping of somebody's culture, And so, in our English language, we've got a certain culture, and then the language that we speak comes from that. But when you go to somebody else's language, you're really kind of stepping in to their culture, and you're seeing the way that they see things. And so that's why I'm saying the way that they saw things was the idea about a generation. It's a birth is what it really is. And that is, you've got a father who is not giving birth to son. I know it's not there, but it's that you've got family, parents that are generating another generation. And then if you extend that, because oftentimes, especially in the Old Testament, the grandchildren sometimes would be the grandfather's sons, so to speak. And so if you've got Abraham, Abraham was called the father of the Jewish people. And when the Jews came up to Jesus, they said, we've never been enslaved to anybody. We have Abraham as our father. And so what they were looking at is they were a generation of Abraham. Does that make sense? Okay. And so that's what I'm saying. If you know, that is that's a good interpretation. It's not a bad interpretation. It's a good interpretation. But as far as that Greek word generation used, it's not used that often. But you can see it in the concept, and you could translate it that way.